Greetings, friends of liberty. Among the more celebrated adventures of our dauntless explorer Captain Cook was his excursion into the South Pacific in 1774, where, upon his return to our sceptred isle, he stopped at a most curious island, Easter Island, so named as it was discovered on Easter Day in 1722 by the Dutch explorer Roggeveen. Both the inhabitants and the isle itself possessed numerous marvels. They had carved and erected enormous legless statues of humans placed on the coast, numbering in the many hundreds. Although very far from Polynesia, they were evidently Polynesian, as our captain could ascertain. See, they were, in contrast to the magnificence of their statues themselves, destitute of tools, of shelter and clothing, obliged to spend all their time in providing food to support their precarious existence. D, the naturalist on board, Forster, remarked, "They also have rats, which it seems they eat, for I saw a man with some dead ones in his hand, and he seemed unwilling to part with them, giving me to understand they were for food." E, there seemed to be many more men on the island than women, though perhaps the ladies, being shy, were in hiding. And finally, the natives had an extraordinary love of and desire for hats of all kinds, either trading for them or even snatching them off of the heads of our sailors. All in all, a most remarkable island. However, if we turn to Easter Island in your 21st century, we find, not surprisingly, that the fascination with Rapa Nui and its statues continues to this day. And in this 2021 book by famous civilizational theorist Jared Diamond, author among others of the brilliant Guns, Germs, and Steel, we find a short 101-page narrative investigating the many intricacies of Easter Island's past and offering an explanation for its demise. Diamond begins his account by describing his intense feelings in 2002 when visiting Easter Island, and specifically its stone quarry at Rapanui, where the giant statues called moai were carved. Diamond says, "No other site that I have visited made such a ghostly impression on me as Rapanui. No one lives in the vicinity today. Of the close to 900 statues made there, almost half of which remain at the quarry, he says that they're mostly 15 to 20 feet tall, but the largest of them 70 feet tall, and weighing from 10 up to 270 tons. The mood of desolation is heightened by reporting that scattered along the roads are 97 more statues, as if abandoned in transport from the quarry. Of the statues that used to line the coast, he claims that many in the end were not erect but thrown down, many of them toppled so as to break them deliberately at the neck." Given the obvious impressiveness of this statuary civilizational achievement and the likely necessity of making and possessing heavy lumber and equipment to move such enormous tonnages, Diamond says that the initial Dutch explorer Roggeveen and subsequent European visitors were surprised to find that the islanders' only watercraft were small and leaky canoes, no more than 10 feet long. Then he advances an important part of his thesis. He says, "The statues' sheer number and size suggest a population much larger than the estimated one of just a few thousand people encountered by European visitors. Would it happen to the former large population? And how large might it have been at its maximum?" He says that by estimating people per house or people per the number of chiefs on the island, that the resulting estimates range from a low of 6,000 to a high of 30,000 people. My own opinion is that the higher estimates are more likely to be correct, in part because those estimates are by the archaeologists with the most extensive experience. He justifies this reasoning by saying that the estimate of only 2,000 made by Europeans in 1864 was made, A, after a likely epidemic of smallpox that occurred a few years earlier, that had killed 7/8 of the population in other Polynesian islands, and B, also after some of the Rapa Nui had been kidnapped as slaves. As he summarizes, for these reasons, it seems to me impossible that the 1864 post-smallpox population of 2,000 people represented the residue of a pre-smallpox, pre-kidnapping population of only 6,000 to 8,000 people. And where did the people who started the colony come from? Earlier theorists, like the Norwegian ethnographer Thor Heyerdahl, had imagined that the colonists came from South America, and the Swiss author Erich Däniken had even postulated aliens descending in spacecraft. So outlandish did these statutory accomplishments by mere mortals seem to him. Of course, given what we know now, the extraordinarily long-ranging maritime accomplishments of the Polynesians who traveled eastwards all the way to Madagascar near Africa and westwards to Hawaii and Easter Island were not uncommon. As Diamond notes, in 1999, the reconstructed Polynesian sailing canoe Hokulea succeeded in reaching Easter from the Polynesian island of Mangariva after a voyage of 17 days. Knowing then that the settlers were Polynesian, a crucial question is when the voyage that colonized Easter Island started. And for that, Diamond estimates somewhat before AD 900. He's saying that radiocarbon dating confirms these results on porpoise bones eaten by settlers and by their campfire charcoal. One problem that the early settlers had was that there are no coral reefs around the island, and so many of the fish that other Polynesian communities found plentiful were rare or non-existent. Fish comprised only 23% of bones found in their diet, whereas in other Polynesian communities, they comprised up to 90%. So because of no coral reefs, they needed to go further out to sea to capture porpoises and tuna. On the other hand, there were enormous numbers of nesting seabirds and seals on the island, and in addition, millions of giant palm trees, now extinct, but then the tallest in the world, covered the gentle slopes. These slopes surrounded 3 extinct volcanoes, the tallest just under 1,700 feet. Given also that the settlers apparently had brought as livestock no pigs or dogs and only chickens and rats by accident, and given also that there were no mammals on the island, they needed to have productive farming, and this they partly achieved by making huge chicken houses and growing the bananas, sugarcane, sweet potato, and taro they had brought with them. Since the island is very windy, they often made stone windbreaks or dug circular pits called manavai to protect their plants. They also used the unique ancient method of farming called lithic agriculture. Lithic agriculture uses rocks in many different ways to increase agricultural productivity by A, mixing small rocks with the soil itself to absorb heat during the day and release it during the night, B, facilitating the leaching of minerals from the rocks during rainstorms, C, preventing a soil erosion during rainfall, and D, minimizing evaporation due to the sun and wind. Experiments have demonstrated up to a doubling of the harvest using these methods. As Diamond summarizes, all of these rock windbreaks and gardens involved a huge effort to construct because they required moving millions or even billions of rocks. Here again, Diamond expands on his theme of civilizational desperation, quoting an archaeologist who said, "I have never been to a Polynesian island where people were so desperate as they were on Easter that they piled small stones together in a circle to plant a few lousy small taro and protect them against the wind." Some archaeologists estimate that rock gardens were first used around 1300 AD and eventually covered most of the island. Sociologically, the colony was organized into a number of clans, which Diamond claims were at first peaceful, but then later became more violent in their interactions. being famous in his other books for regarding geography as highly influential in civilizational development, he here claims that the initial peacefulness between clans was due to the gentle terrain which forced people to interact. Unlike, for example, in the Hawaiian Islands with their steep ravines. Further, he believes that those competing clan territories were also integrated religiously and to some extent economically and politically under the leadership of one paramount chief. The clans would sell items that they produced which differed depending on the region they lived in and what resources it contained. Let's now turn to the statues, the heaviest of which weighs 87 tons and the tallest measures 32 feet. Here Diamond strikes a note of incredulousness, saying, "Knowing what we do about Easter Island technology, it seems impossible that the islanders could have ever transported and erected it, and we have to wonder what megalomania possessed its carvers." He notes that the average size of the statues increased over time and that the islanders even put hats, called pukao, weighing up to 12 tons, on the heads of the statues. He speculates that this was caused by competition among rival clan chiefs to one-up the other chiefs. As he says of the hats, they seem to proclaim, "All right, so you can erect a statue 30 feet high, but look at me, I can put this 12-ton pukao on top of my statue. You try to top that, you wimp." What method does he believe that the Rapa Nui used to transport the statues from the quarry to the coast? He says, "The method most convincing to me is Joanne van Tilburg's suggestion that Easter Islanders modified the so-called canoe ladders that were widespread on Pacific islands for transporting heavy logs. She found that 50 to 70 people working 5 hours per day and dragging the sled 5 yards at a pull could transport an average 12-ton statue 9 miles in a week. By extrapolation, transport of even big statues could have been accomplished by a team of 500 adults. He believes that this process used lots of timber, which would have been supplied from the giant palms, and much rope constructed from tree bark. He concludes by saying, "The whole operation of constructing statues and platforms must have been enormously expensive of resources for whose accumulation, transport, and delivery the chiefs commissioning the statues must have arranged." A controversial important question, as the title of the book suggests, is how and why the giant palm forest eventually vanished. He lists 6 possible reasons. The palms were, number 1, burned for firewood. Number 2, used to create many thousands of bodies of to cremate many thousands of bodies of the deceased. 3, cleared for gardens. 4, to make seaworthy canoes. 5, to furnish timber and rope for transporting and erecting statues. And 6, because the nuts of the palm trees were used by the rats for food. And when this deforestation was completed? Hard to say, but likely from 1500 to 1640 AD at the latest. He also believes that massive erosion occurred as a result. And he then further paints a picture of an insular dystopia, speaking of starvation, a population crash, and a descent into cannibalism, as well as civil war and a collapse of the power of the chiefs. At this point, he claims rival clans switched from erecting increasingly large statues to throwing down one another's statues by toppling a statue forward onto a slab, placed so that the statue would fall on the slab and break. And the islanders also adopted a new religion at this time. So this concludes our description of Diamond's ideas about the course of Easter Island's history and its decline. The worm in the apple for Diamond in all this is that among the plethora of books available on Easter Island is the book The Statues That Walked by Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt. In this book, the authors paint a very different picture in some respects of what happened. By way of criticism, let's examine their alternative Easter Island history. Criticism number 1. As the title of their 2012 book indicates, and their arguments conclusively show, the method of statue transportation had already been discovered and published 9 years before Diamond even wrote his book. And that method involved walking the statues like modern moving men do with refrigerators. If they don't have a dolly underneath, from one corner of the fridge to another, kitty corner out the door. The islanders instead simply using ropes to tilt the statue from one side to the other as it walked. The amount of evidence that this was the actual method used, at least in most instances, for the long distances from the quarry to the coast is overwhelming. Let's review it. A. First, you can see the actual method practiced using just ropes with small teams on the right, back, and left of the statue in YouTube videos. The amount of effort expended to move the statues is relatively small compared to other methods using sleds or canoe ladders. And it takes no logs or wood made from palm trees, which radically changes Diamond's estimation of the alleged huge number of trees and lumber needed to move the statues. B. The statues were specifically designed, that is, carved, to facilitate moving in precisely this way, with the lower part and the base being deliberately left thick, reducing the chances they would topple over while moving. Then, only after it was put on its pedestal on the coast, was the lower part carved thinner. In addition, the front and back edges on the bottom were rounded to enable easy rocking, and the side edges were straight. Also, the statues were angled slightly forward, moving the center of gravity forward to facilitate being walked. C. The islanders had a specific name for this method of moving called neki neki. Neki neki translates as inching forward by moving the body with disabled legs, or no legs at all. D. There were numerous roads, some of which the authors discovered on foot, and others by looking at satellite photos whose surface was densely packed, just as it would be if the statues had been walked over them. These roads led from the quarry to the various spots on the coastline. The roadbeds were specifically prepared, being cut into hillsides to ensure mild gradients up and down, with surface stones removed. E. Some statues were abandoned along the roadway. In many cases, these were left there because they had broken apart, presumably when they had accidentally fell over while being walked. In addition, the authors found that of these fallen statues, when statues were heading upslope, we usually found them resting on their backs, and when heading downslope, they were on their faces. This is more support for the argument that the statues were moved upright. F. The statues often had damage on the sides of their bases, exactly where it should be if they were rocked to and fro as they were walked. Criticism number 2. As mentioned, given the efficiency and relative ease of this walking method, the number of people and thus the amount of resources needed to carve out and move the statues becomes much less than Diamond imagines, and thus the maximum Easter Island population needed to produce all the statues becomes much less. As the authors summarize, there is no reason to suspect that population sizes for the island ever greatly exceeded the number witnessed at the time of European contact in AD 1722, which was about 2,000 to 3,000. Number 3. The authors believe that the Polynesians arrived at Easter Island much later than Diamond, perhaps around 1200 AD instead of 900. Their reasons for believing this are that the radiocarbon dating of firewood by some archaeologists may be mistaken. This is because tree rings of trees hundreds of years old can obviously have a huge range of years and don't necessarily indicate when the wood was burned, but only when the trees grew. In addition, as they say, recently acquired dates from new pollen studies on the island had shown the first signs of human presence to be at about the same time, and recent studies also showed sudden environmental changes around AD 1200. Number 4. Regarding deforestation, Although Diamond mentions that the rats gnawed on the nuts of the giant palms, which made them infertile, and also mentions the rats as one of the 6 reasons for deforestation, he implicates slash-and-burn agriculture and statute transportation as the main reason for the destruction of the forest. But other researchers, such as Steve Athens in Hawaii, have apparently shown, using the pollen record, that some forests in Hawaii were destroyed before the fires from slash and burn occurred there, which would mean that something else was causing the destruction. And in these forests of Hawaii, the bones of huge amounts of rats are dated to about the time of the forest destruction, about a century before the slash and burn agriculture commenced. As Lipo and Hunt say, the stunning realization was that rats alone were capable of instigating massive, even rapid deforestation. Neither fire nor felling of trees was necessary, even though Polynesians certainly transformed their islands for agricultural production. This phenomenon has been found on other islands in the Pacific as well, such as New Zealand and Lord Howe Island, where the rats not only destroyed all the vegetation, but many animal and bird species. The authors summarize their argument by saying, after the Polynesian colonists arrived on the island, in about AD 1200, the rats they brought with them gorged themselves on the unlimited food supply. Millions of giant palm trees offered a virtually endless buffet of nuts. Laboratory studies of rat reproductive potential under such ideal conditions document that populations can double every 47 days. Number 5. The authors also dispute the occurrence of the vast cataclysmic civil war and strife the Diamond imagines, arguing that A, the skeletal remains of prehistoric Rapa Nui show few signs of lethal trauma, and B, that many of the obsidian tools, such as mata'a, that might be interpreted as weapons of war, were likely instead used as tools for plant agriculture. The authors say, microscopic studies of the wear patterns on the edges of mata'a have shown the damage and use wear was the result of cutting and scraping of fibrous plant materials. In addition, the toppling of the statues that Diamond attributes to rival clans may simply have been due to earthquakes or their tremors. Number 6. There is direct evidence that, like many native societies, when encountering the ships and prolific amounts of goods possessed and given to them by modern explorers, they developed a cargo cult, as happened to various tribes in Fiji and New Guinea and elsewhere in the South Pacific, both before and after World War II. If this were the case, cargo cults being a type of new religion might also explain why the islanders at times tore down or toppled their statues, which had religious meaning. In addition, after the arrival of European ships, they made houses in the shape of boats, in which they mimicked Europeans giving away goods. Thus, the authors believe that with the arrival of Europeans, the rationale for participating in moai construction and movement had been undermined. The acquisition of European goods became the new form of obtaining prestige, and the islanders demonstrated that they would go to almost any length to acquire these items. In summary, given the weight of all these objections, the conclusion of these authors is very different from that of Jared Diamond. They say, rather than a case of abject failure, Rapa Nui is an unlikely story of success. Using the skills, knowledge, and materials available and adapting them to meet the specific conditions, the islanders transformed Rapa Nui from an island covered in palm forest, with few resources for humans, into an island that could reliably, though marginally, sustain them over the long run. Thus, my verdict for the last trio on Easter Island cannot be positive. Most damning is not only that Diamond appears to be significantly wrong on numerous points, but that he doesn't address the strong contrary evidence for many of his claims. And that, in a scientist, is inexcusable, meaning this book only gets a D+. This book may also be an illustration of the modern green ideology that increasingly pervades the humanities. Meanwhile, here in London, I'm very grateful to be able to look outside and see the many tall oaks, chestnuts, and poplars that shade the grounds of our estate. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.